The last of the recovered bodies from Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 have arrived in the Netherlands. 38 coffins were flown on Dutch and Australian planes, bringing the total number of returned bodies to 227. But unrecovered bodies still remain at the crash site. The prime ministers of the Netherlands and Australia will work together to recover bodies at that site. Australia will send hundreds of police and defense forces as part of the joint investigation. For more on the investigation, I'm joined now by Eric Brattberg, and he's a resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. And Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Tell us, right now, do you think Vladimir Putin is panicking with all the pressure on him?
I think Vladimir Putin has been counting all along that the pressure from the West would not be very significant. I think there has been sort of a sense of waking up, at least in Europe, after the crash of MH17, where 211 European citizens died. So I think that there is a sense of putting more pressure on Putin, including toughening some of the economic sanctions. Now, whether that will be enough to, cause Vladimir Putin to stop actively supporting separatists in Russia and to call upon them to lay down their arms and negotiate with Ukrainian authorities, I think remains to be seen.
What will it take to get him to blink? Will it be military pressure, sanctions, political movement? What will it take?
Yeah, well, I think you need to consider toughening the economic sanctions. There have already been a variety of economic sanctions put forward. None of them have really caused Russia to change its actions. So that's why I think it's important that the US, which have already taken some significant steps, are now being followed by the European Union to move in what's called a phase-free type of sanctions, which would include directed, targeted sanctions, also looking at Russian economic sectors, including the financial sector, possibly defense sector, to really try to put some pressure on Putin.
Is it true that some of the most elite are leaving the area?
Leaving Russia.
Right.
There is certainly an opposition in Russia that is being marginalized. There's a lack of freedoms. There's a lack of freedom of press. Russian economy is not doing as well as it did a few years ago. So certainly highly educated, highly skilled people are leaving the country. So that is a problem for Vladimir Putin at home.
Mm-hmm. Has this been part of his master plan all along to create this greater Russia or to seize Ukraine?
I think we've seen a tendency for a long time. We had a war in Georgia in 2008. We've seen Russia increasing the pressure on some Eastern European states. I think Russia's ultimately, its goal is to seek to reassert its influence in what it views as its traditional sphere of influence, particularly in Eastern Europe, but also to stop the European Union and NATO from expanding into this part of Eastern Europe. And I think, we should remember that the crisis in Ukraine originally started when Ukraine wanted to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union, and Russia said they were not allowed to do that. Then what eventually followed was brutal crackdowns on protests on the square of Kiev, the Russian invasion of Crimea, and right now a pro-separatist movement in eastern Ukraine, fueled and supported by Moscow.
So who in the European Union really needs to step up to the plate and hold his feet to the fire, so to speak? Because he's most afraid of Germany, probably.
He is, and he is counting on a Europe that is divided. So I think what is ultimately really important is that the European Union get its act together, agrees on toughening sanctions. That includes bringing countries that have been reluctant, including Germany, but also the UK, also some of the Eastern European countries, such as Hungary, Italy, which is very dependent on Russian energy, bringing all these countries together to really take some of these tough economic sanctions that I mentioned, and ultimately have this be a strategy that is a joint transatlantic strategy, where the United States and the European Union together puts this kind of pressure on Moscow.
What would be the disadvantage for him if he admitted it, said he was sorry, and that he didn't mean to shoot down the plane?
I think there would be a diplomatic opening from the West. I think the West has been very clear that it wants to have good relations with Russia, but he wants to be feared. He wants to be seen as a great leader, a leader of a Russia that is powerful. He doesn't seek to win any popularity contests in Europe. He wants to be seen as a fearful, great leader. And I think our job is to make sure that his ambitions of creating this kind of greater Russia, creating this Eurasian Union that he's talked about, are undermined. And that's why sanctions are so important.
Eric Brattberg with the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for coming in. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.